Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, Scale Model Kit Review. Welcome back to another exciting installment of Build the Batmobile by FanHome. Welcome back to SMKR Studio and welcome back to Build the Batmobile by FanHome. I am back with pack number 8, which includes 6 more phases, phase 33 through 38. Remember, you can subscribe to this for yourself. Head over to FanHome and subscribe to this today. I put a direct link in the comments below. In this pack, I also received a free gift. Now remember, these free gifts can vary depending on when you subscribe to this, but this time I did receive this awesome Batman mug. Fantastic there. Let's go ahead and look at the individual phases that came in this pack. Phase 33, the leaf spring. Phase 34, the parts for the leaf spring. Phase 35, components for the steering. Phase 36, the drive shaft. Phase 37, the floor pan. And Phase 38, more parts for the floor pan. Let's get started. Let's look at the magazine and the build instructions for Phase 33. This time, the TV show, Season 1, Episode 33, Find Finny Friends. The Tower of Babel, which is the great Batman comics from the year 2000. Batman 67. This is Batman year by year. And our parts, we get the other side of the rear end, which is the right rear leaf spring. And we'll go ahead and install that. And for this issue, to make the video a little bit shorter, I'm not going to show you every step. I'm going to show you completed steps here. I'm not going to show you every screw going in and out, but if I incur any problems, I'll go ahead and explain that to you. But that's what that looks like. Install the shock absorber there. Let me get the parts. Here's the parts for 33. Let's get a closer look. Here's a close-up of those parts. Everything here is metal. We have the leaf spring for the right side, very nice. We have the mounting plate, and note it is marked with an R. We have the U-bolts. We have EM screws. We have the nuts for the U-bolts and the shock. We're going to assemble the leaf spring in the first step, and here's the leaf spring here, and we want to make sure that the short side is facing the shaft for the pumpkin there, and that's going to go on top. We're also going to mount the plate on top of that. Now what I've done is I've started the threads with the screw here, and I'm going to back it out, and I'll go ahead and assemble everything. Just makes everything easier. I'll leave everything kind of loose, and I'll put the U-bolts on next. And the U-bolts have been installed. I tightened down the nuts, just kind of snugged them down, not real tight, making sure everything looks pretty even there. And I did suggest you add some Loctite to these threads. I'm going to do that later on after this is mounted to the chassis, and then I'll Loctite them in place once everything's lined up. But I did use the little wrench for that. And one thing you want to do with these nuts, make sure that they're even. See the amount of threads that are coming out the other end? Make sure they're all the same on both sides. And that's just like a real car. When you're installing these on your own car, like I did for my Jeep Cherokee, you want to make sure they're even, because you can put undue stress on one side of the U-bolt versus the other side. Next, go ahead and install the shock absorber. And I already pre-started the threads here, just like I showed you earlier. And we'll just make sure it's still a little bit loose. There we go. And that completes phase 33. Let's head over to phase 34. Let's look at phase 34 magazine and build instructions. TV show, season 1, episode 34, Batman Makes the Scenes. Great Batman comics. Fever from 1988. Year by Year, Batman 68. And our parts, this time we're going to have all the parts here to install the rear suspension to the frame. Very cool there. Alright, let me get the parts, I'll be right back. Here's parts for 34. Let's get a closer look. Here's a close-up of those parts, and these are fantastic here. Everything is made of metal. I'm just floored by the detail here. But these two plates here are marked left and right. And more U-bolts, very cool there. The nuts for the U-bolts, spring, EM screw, and AJM screw. Going to secure the left spring hanger on this side here of the pumpkin. If you turn it over, you'll see how the AJM screw goes into that. It goes through the loop of the spring, and we'll tighten that down. And you can see it's tightened down, but it's still able to move. And that's what it looks like there. And the same thing on the right hand side here. Now I'm going to go ahead and work on the rear hanger, and that's this right here. These parts are exactly the same for both sides, and it's actually just going to mount up against that like that, and we're going to put our U-bolt through that. And you can see how that U-bolt fits. We're going to take and put our little plate on this. We want the thick side towards the aft, just like that. And we'll put our nuts on that and tighten them down evenly. And there you go. The nuts are installed, and I made sure they're installed evenly and they're snugged down. Later on, I will go ahead and put some thread locker on there. And this is what I use here. I have the blue. You can buy the red also. Permatex thread locker. And the other side is also done. Now I'm ready to mount this to the frame. Alright, I brought over the frame, which has the engine mounted to it already, and we're going to put the rear end on the back side here. Rear end over, and it will get mounted in place. Now you got to be very careful here. You're going to need to turn over the chassis to do this, so I would recommend you have a very soft towel to put this on top of, or hold this in your lap or something, so that way when you flip this over, you're protecting the top of the engine. Okay, so because we need to have it like this to put the rear end on. Now to help me out, to make this a little easier, I just put a little dab of super glue on the end here, and I put the spring on there. I'm going to let it dry a little bit, and it's just going to make it easier. I'm not going to lose these springs in my carpet monster. Okay, I got the rear end installed, and you can see it there. And it was a matter of putting in 2 EM screws on the front here, the front shackles, and making sure I inserted the shocks where they needed to be, and it really helped having those springs glued in place, and they're not going to rattle around in there also. That's good there. And then as far as the back shackles, they pin inside, and then on the other side you put in EM screws on each side. I tightened them all down, and then I went ahead and made sure my rear end mounts here on each side, the EM screws on top, are tightened down. And then I just rechecked my nuts for the U-bolts one more time. And then after I install the floor pan, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to put my Loctite on all these nuts, the ones on the back also. But that's what it looks like from that side. So that completes phase 34. Let's head over and do phase 35. Let's look at the magazine and build instructions for phase 35. The TV show, Season 2, Episode 35, Shoot a Crooked Arrow. And great Batman comics, Batman and Son from 2006. Batman Year by Year, Batman 69. And this time we're working on the steering box, or the steering mechanism as they call it. There's all the parts. We'll install the gearbox. I'm going to go ahead and use a little bit of lubricant for that, and I'll show you what I use. And make sure that's all together. Then we're going to install it on the frame. And there you go. Let's look at the parts. Here's the parts for 35. Let's get a closer look. AM, ZM screws, the gearbox halves, and you can see it's made of metal. Very nice there. And of course our gears, very nice. Everything here is made of metal, and our little U-joint. Here's the 2 halves of the gearbox, and I'm going to be using some anti-wear AW grease from Tamiya. This is for RC cars. And you can see how that looks. So the first thing we're going to do is throw a little grease in here. Okay, so I put a little grease in the gearbox housing, and we have 2 parts here. Now we need to pay attention to the instructions with this. This right here, they show it to where the threads end. So we want the threads end to be right on top. And I don't know if you can see that, but there's your last set of threads where they end. We'll put that on top. Okay, so, and we want the U-joint hookup sitting on top also. So that's going to go just like that. Okay. And the next one, it's going to go down on top here, and we want to make sure that the flats are kind of angled, so it's going to go down just like that. Now we'll go ahead and put the housing on. Okay, got the grease there. I'll go ahead and insert it next through the shaft. There we go. And 2 AM screws will go into this. There we go. So everything rotates now, everything's greased up. And that's how that looks. Now I'll assemble the U-joint, and I did start the threads on all 4 corners, and simply just going to go on here like that with ZM screws. Okay, all the screws are installed on that U-joint, and I went ahead and installed the drive shaft too. Everything rotates and spins around like it should. Now we'll go ahead and install this on the chassis frame. Next, I'm going to go ahead and install the gearbox, and it's going to insert right here on the top, the 2 points. I already started the threads on those, just so I don't put undue stress on the suspension while I'm screwing it down. And that's going to go down on that. This is also, this bottom part is going to insert into the steering linkage down below. And I'm going to have to do that off camera because I have to turn it over to do it. Well, we'll go ahead and put these screws in first. And these are all AM screws that are going into this. Okay, so that gearbox shaft goes into the steering mechanism down below, and you can see it only goes in one way. It's keyed. So you may have to turn the gearbox a little bit to get it to line up. And then once you have it inserted fully, you can put your screw in from the bottom. And you can see there, it's fully inserted. And I'll put my AM screw in from the bottom. And you can see the screw in is in all the way, and it freely rotates. And that's all I do with phase 35. Let's head over and do phase 36. Let's look at the magazine and build instructions for phase 36. TV show, season 2, episode 36, Walk the Straight and Narrow. Great Batman Comics, 1948, The Riddler. Batman year by year would be Batman 70. And we get to work on the drive shafts. Several U-joints to install here. Pretty easy to do here. And then we'll actually mount the drive shafts from the rear end to the transmission. Let's look at the parts. Here's the parts for phase 36. Let's get a closer look. And here they are. We got 2 halves of a drive shaft made of plastic. This shaft here is also made of plastic, the shorter one. The end piece, plastic. The bearing support, plastic. And the U-joints, AP screws. First thing I did is I installed the U-joint, and everything here is plastic, so these screws are made for plastic. These are the AP screws, so you want to make it so you have a little bit of rotation on them. And I'll just tighten this one down just a little bit. That's good there. Now we're going to mount this other drive shaft to that, same thing, 2 AP screws go into that. There you go. That's installed. A little bit of movement there. Now we'll go ahead and take our bearing, and that's going to slide on this first, just like that. And we're going to take our drive shaft that's in 2 halves, and we're going to insert that like that. Put the other half on it and screw it down. I put 2 AP screws into this to keep the halves together, and then I put the universal joint on the end of that. Now we'll go ahead and mount this to our chassis. Alright, I brought over the chassis, and we're going to mount the drive shaft to this. The longer drive shaft that we screwed together is going to mount to the transmission. It already has a U-joint on it, so we're just going to line up that U-joint to that. And remember your bearing for the drive shaft, that's not going to get mounted just yet. It's going to be loose. We're going to actually install this in phase 38. And then the other end, a shorter drive shaft, will mount to our differential case on the other end. We use an AP screws for those U-joints. Both U-joints are assembled, the one at the differential and the one at the transmission. Excellent. And here's our bearing. Like I said, we'll install that on phase 38. That completes phase 36. Let's head over and do phase 37. Let's look at phase 37 magazine and instructions. TV show season 2, episode 37, Hot Off the Griddle. Great Batman comics from 1969. The Senator's been shot. And Batman year by year, we got Batman 71. And here's our part. This time we received the floor pan. We're going to mount that to the frame. There we go. Let's look at the parts. Here it is. Very large, protected floor pan. Let's get a closer look. Again, here it is, protected. Very nice. And here's a close-up of the pan. It is made of metal. Very nice. And our CM screws. So we're going to mount this to the frame. We're going to be using 12 of the CM screws. They tell us to make sure all your screw holes line up the way they should on the frame before you start driving in the screws. So the key here is, well, we'll get all the screws started. We'll keep them loose. Make sure every one of them are started, and then we'll tighten them down. We'll use 3-in-1 oil on those screws. Here's the pan. We'll line it up to the front first, making sure that none of our hoses and such are in the way. And of course the steering box mechanism also out of the way. There we go. Looking good. Now I'll go ahead and start to put my screws in. Got to put in 12. I got all 12 screws installed, and I didn't have any issues whatsoever lining up any of the holes. The first thing I did, though, before I actually put this down on top of the frame, I made sure that all the screws on the frame themselves were tight. So I just re-verified they're all tight, and I had to tighten up a few, but it wasn't too bad. And then I went ahead and laid this down. Like I said, you want to have your steering shaft out of the way, some of your hoses out of the way. And I started from the front, and when I worked my way back, I started all the screws first. I used some oil. And then after all the screws were started, all 12, then I tightened them down from the back, working my way forward. And I went ahead and I supported the weight of this with my hand while I put the screws in. I didn't want to put any undue stress on the suspension. The weakest part of all these part work kits are the suspension. So you definitely don't want to put too much stress on there. So while you're driving your screws in to make them tight, hold up your suspension so you don't put stress on it. So there you go. That completes phase 37. Let's head over and do the final phase for this video, phase 38. Let's look at the final phase for Pack 8, phase 38. TV show, season 2, episode 38, The Cat and the Fiddle. Batman Comics from 1978, The Laughing Fish. Batman Year by Year, this is Batman 72. Very cool. And here's our parts. We're going to put in what they call the seat pan onto the floor. And we're going to be using CM screws for that. We're going to be using about 10 CM screws to install that seat pan. And then we're going to install the drive shaft bearing. And I'll show you something with that before we get started. Let's look at the parts first. Here's the parts for 38. Let's get a closer look. CM screws, AP screws, and here's our seat pan. It is made of plastic, but of course it's going to mount down on holes that are metal, so that's why the CM screws are being used. But there you go. Okay, so before installing the seat pan, we want to make sure our bearing support for the drive shaft is positioned correctly, and I'll show you a close-up of that and what I mean. If you look at your bearing, it's just like that. Okay, where the mounts are on the bottom, and that's the way you want it. That way when we put our seat item inside, everything mounts down flush like it should. All your holes mount down flush. And it may help to go ahead and put the screws in for the bearing first, and then turn it over and put your CM screws on top. Alright, my AM screws are installed, both of them. They're a little loose, not tight yet. I'll go ahead and turn this over and put the CM screws on top. Okay, I put all the screws in and everything's tight. This gives you a view of what the underside looks like. Looks great. Both the screws for the bearing are tight and installed. And turn this over, and you can see all 10 CM screws are tight on top. And that's it. That completes phase 38. I'll be right back. And there you have it. That completes Pack 8. And very easy to do. I had no problems whatsoever doing anything here. And if you follow my recommendations, you shouldn't have any problems also. So if you haven't done so already, head over to FanHome and subscribe to this build today. It's fantastic. Get it while it's still available. With that, if you like my content, please subscribe and smash that like button. Happy modeling, everybody, and we'll see you at Pack 9 coming very shortly. Take care.